Have you ever wanted to design your own computer and build it, but felt that it was far too complex a task? Well, if that's the case, I'm about to show you a really intuitive tool called PCPartPicker. It's very simple to pick up, very intuitive and user-friendly, and doesn't require quite a bit of computer knowledge to begin with. So before we get into that, I do want to highlight a few things. For starters, you can find the link to this part list within the blog post, and the link to the site also within the blog post. However, something that's important to cover before we get into it, the estimated wattage is important to keep track of for when you select your power supply, and every time you add a part, this will refresh with a new value. Additionally, if you have compatibility notes, you might want to check out. This disclaimer is just a standard one that they usually give. It doesn't really mean anything, but they just simply want you to be aware that there might be some things that might not be able to be maxed out. For example, like maybe depending on what graphics card you pick, you might end up have a RAM slot that's blocked. But those are tiny details that aren't a big deal. Overall, you can trust PCPartPicker to provide you with reliable information on the parts, the dimensions, and so on. Now, back to the CPU. In this case, I've decided to go ahead with an AMD build. But if, as I mentioned, if you decide that you want to do an Intel NVIDIA build, that's perfectly acceptable, or an Intel AMD build, or an AMD NVIDIA build. It's just that AMD tends to work very well, and Intel NVIDIA tends to work better together. They're just designed better that way. Now, when you pick the CPU, it is the first part that you're going to pick, and that's why they put it at the top. So once you pick the CPU that you desire, you can scroll down and you can actually select right here between compatible parts. You can select from very competent filters, the CPU coolers and motherboards, and maybe you have some other things you want to filter out, but you'll know that everything there is supposed to be compatible with your CPU. Now, I opted for a fan CPU, a fan CPU cooler. Now, you can do liquid cooling, although I would advise against it for beginners because it is trickier to install, and you certainly run the risk of, if you do it improperly, damaging your PC parts and potentially ruining the rig that you just assembled. So I wouldn't recommend it, but if you're up for the challenge, just know that that's the risk that comes with it. Fan coolers, there are plenty of high quality ones. It doesn't really matter in the sense that, like, if you have a fan CPU cooler, you're not going to need to necessarily upgrade it to a water-cooled one eventually. A lot of that is personal preference, although water coolers do have an additional perk of where they help lower the temperature of your overall computer system much better than a fan CPU would. But if you have everything that you need, like a case that has very good cable management, as well as you have the adequate amount of fans installed into your case, regardless of the CPU cooler, you should be fine. But if you know that you're going to be doing very complex tasks, like perhaps maybe rendering animations or something like that, you may want to consider water cooling. Now, I've certainly spent quite a bit of time on the CPU cooler, and I'd like to move on to the motherboard. As you can see here, I have an MSI B650 Gaming Plus Wi-Fi ATX AM5 motherboard. Now, a lot of that probably sounds like just complete jargon to you, and most of that is honestly not very relevant, but the things that are important are this AM5, because if we go back to our CPU and we scroll down, you will see that our socket is the AM5 socket. So that is the chip shape, and that's very important because motherboards are actually designed around a particular processor or a series of processors. So it's important to make sure that you choose your processor first for that reason, so that you really have what you want and you're not stuck with a limited option because you selected your motherboard first. And this ATX will come into play later as we go through the other parts. So bear that in mind and try and keep an eye out for this ATX later on. Now, to cover storage, I'm not going to spend too much time covering this stuff because it's fairly trivial. But I do want to mention that the memory sticks, which is also referred to as RAM, random access memory. The 64 gigabytes is quite a bit. You don't really need that. I just put that there. The only thing that you really want to make sure of is that you're not buying outdated RAM just because it's really cheap. Like, for example, if this were DDR3, I don't believe this motherboard would be able to support it. And you can actually see what your motherboard can support in terms of RAM architecture and speed. So in this case, it's only DDR5s between this range. So that's important to remember. So you don't want to choose RAM that's far more sophisticated, or I should say advanced, than your motherboard, and vice versa. You don't want to choose, obviously, RAM that's unsupported by your motherboard because it's too outdated. Additionally, the hard drive, you have many options that you can go down. You can, as you can see here, you can add additional drives. You just want to keep in mind that you don't end up buying more, for example, M.2 slots than what your PC can actually support, or I should say your motherboard rather. In this case, I opted for an M.2, which is considered to be the status quo now. It's the front runner for storage solutions. It's very simple to install. However, you certainly can opt for a traditional hard drive disk, although they're becoming fairly obsolete. But they do make for good economic solutions to high storage, although they're not as fast as SSDs or M.2 SSDs. SSD simply means solid state drive. And so you have quite a bit of choice with that. So do as you would like. Now, if we move on to the video card, you might notice that, as I mentioned earlier, I said that I was doing an AMD, and you see here it says Gigabyte. Gigabyte is simply just the manufacturer, and there are many companies that manufacture graphics cards. Graphics cards, video cards, they're interchangeable terms. I'm going to probably bounce between the two throughout the video, but just remember that it's the same thing. Now, the way that you know that this is an AMD card is because every AMD card is called Radeon, and then it has some R number, and then XT, or maybe doesn't have XT, like RX or R something. I think most of them now are RX, but in the past they weren't always. And the 16 gigabytes actually refers to the video RAM that comes with this video card. Now, video cards are interesting because they aren't quite their own computers, but they have quite a bit of their own components within them that make it seem like they're almost their own computer. And in fact, actually in Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin miners are typically comprised of just a simple motherboard and GPU, which is graphics processing unit, which is another term for video card. So they actually typically only comprise of that because there's actually a tremendous amount of computing power within just a singular graphics card. So it's rather impressive what you can do just with a graphics card alone, and the applications for them are very wide. And that's why they're typically, as you can see if you look at the parts, the most expensive part in your build. It depends on what you're building and whatnot, but typically graphics cards tend to be the most expensive part in most builds. Especially if you're like a serious gamer and you want a top-of-the-line graphics card, you're going to be paying quite a bit for that. $500 is certainly not a cheap card, but it's definitely not the most expensive. The point is, though, that this build is just a template build for you, the viewer, to understand kind of what a computer looks like in PCPartPicker in the design methodology before you even consider buying it. Now, if we move on to the case, that term ATX that I mentioned earlier with the motherboard is back. And ATX is actually the form factor, which kind of refers to the dimensionality and shape of the motherboard and the case. So this is an ATX full tower case. There's different sizes of cases. You can have a ITX, you can have a mini tower. There's plenty of options on the table. I'm not going to go through them, but I've personally always enjoyed full towers because they allow for better airflow and they allow for maybe not the most desirable cable management when you install. So they allow for a bit more mistakes, and I think it's definitely better for rookie or beginner computer designers to opt for a full tower for those reasons. Now, ATX is also important when you consider the power supply, because you don't want your parts, not just the motherboard, but your power supply also, especially considering it's channeling electricity. You don't want it moving around or anything like that. You want it rigid in place so that you don't risk having any damage happen. Now, as you can see here, I picked the Corsair 850 watt gold certified fully modular ATX power supply. So there's a few key things that need to be kept in mind about this power supply. So if we scroll back, I did mention in the beginning the estimated wattage. As you add parts, it goes up, right? However, something that you definitely want to keep in mind is that you don't want, say, because you could definitely find a 650 watt power supply, but I would not opt for that at all, because that would effectively mean that your power supply has to be operating at peak capacity practically always, especially if you're doing anything like if this were a computer that I were going to be gaming on, anytime I'd be gaming, my power supply would be working at peak efficiency all the time. So you're going to wear out your power supply pretty easily doing that. So it's certainly not recommended to do that. So you want to have a power supply that is comfortably capable of handling much larger watts, or larger quantity of watts, I should say. You're going to want a power supply that can handle that, because not even just for your day-to-day, but also in the long term, if you consider upgrading components or adding new components in, like for example, maybe I want to add additional RAM sticks, or maybe I want to do a crossfire with my video card, which simply means having two of the same card on the motherboard, which not every motherboard supports, so you have to make sure that your motherboard can support that. And the beauty of this is that even once you're done designing, you can always just update things, and PCPartPicker will inform you if your motherboard can support that. Now, even 850 watts is a little low. Excuse me, is a little low if you wanted to do, for example, adding a second graphics card, because they do consume a lot of power. But if you say had a 1000 watt power supply, I'm sure that would certainly be sufficient, and for future upgrades. So it's certainly a personal preference, but if you definitely just want to focus maybe on saving money, it's understandable, and you might want to opt for not the most expensive one. The other important thing that you want to know also is that the term fully modular describes the cables that extend from your power supply and connect to different components within your computer, like the video card or the motherboard itself and so on. So something you want is fully modular. There are some that are semi-modular. I personally don't like that. Some people maybe do. They're very good for if you're manufacturing, like say, the same type of computer, in huge volumes, like companies like Hewlett-Packard, Lenovo, Dell. They probably would appreciate that more, because they have a much more simple design for their computers, and so they probably don't want to have to worry about all those cable alignments and whatnot. But in our instance, where we're just designing a single-use computer that is just for an individual or maybe a couple of friends or whatever, it's not preferred. So you want to make sure that with your power supply that you have full modularity, so that way you can really control cable management and whatnot. You don't have to worry about that. Now, moving on to the optical drive, it's not required, especially in today's age. Most things are downloaded digitally, but it is always nice to have, in my opinion. Maybe it's just because I grew up with CDs, being that I'm 22 now, but it is certainly nice to have an optical drive, because you never know. Sometimes, even for example, graphics cards, their drivers might come on discs, and you don't necessarily need those discs. You can download them online as well, but sometimes it's just nice to use the disc, especially if you're downloading a bunch of other things online. It helps soften the load on your internet connection. But you want to make sure that your case actually supports optical drives, which the vast majority do, but sometimes you find a case that actually doesn't. So you certainly want to make sure, because otherwise you're just going to waste, in this case, $23. But if you maybe buy a more robust one, might be something like $50, so something to keep in mind. And I put that there because I put the DVD version of Windows 11 in my build. Now, moving on to the wireless network adapter, you don't necessarily need that, because in this build, actually, the motherboard does have a Wi-Fi adapter chip on the motherboard, but I've always preferred having a separate adapter because I always felt that they were usually more powerful and more reliable than those simple motherboard chips. But if you want to save money, you certainly can do that. Additionally, Ethernet has always been superior to wireless connections, so if you can go for Ethernet, I'd recommend that on top of either option. But again, these are all personal design choices based off of how your internet is, where you're building your computer, where the computer will be located. There's a lot of things you should consider before really following through. And then, of course, with your case, before we wrap up, you can see here in the pictures, you have slots for different for case fans. Some will come with their own case fans, and they're usually pretty good, but many will require that either you buy some, or some even will require that you buy actually all of them, which is unfortunate. But that's not a big deal because case fans are actually pretty cheap, and I will show you here. Oh wow, these are actually kind of, oh, it's because it's multiple, right? Yeah, so 3 packs, they're not terribly expensive. I mean, even here actually, you can find some that are less than $20 for 3, which is pretty incredible. I wouldn't recommend buying them because odds are they're probably made with a very cheap plastic and they might break easily or bend easily. So you definitely want to pick a higher grade one, but at the end of the day, most of these are pretty high quality. So sometimes you might just want to go for what might fit your aesthetic more, because there is certainly an aesthetic to most computers. And monitors are all the same in the sense of, like, I'm not going to even cover really what makes a good monitor versus a bad monitor, but the higher your hertz is means that's your refresh rate, and the 2560 by 1440 is your resolution. Refresh rate, the higher it is, obviously the better, but you also don't want to exceed the refresh rate that your video card can support, which in this case is a pretty high powerful one, so I don't think that's going to be really much of an issue. But if you say we're trying to save money on the graphics card and maybe you wanted to upgrade one later on, you don't want to buy a state-of-the-art like $600 monitor, because odds are you're not going to be able to fully embrace all the perks that come with it. And when you're done, if you want to show your friends who maybe are interested in the parts, you can always just copy your own list link and send it to whoever you'd like. But overall, this is a pretty sound build. You could build this computer if you wanted to. You could swap out components as you feel the need to. But overall, this is a very achievable, buildable computer, and I wish you all the best in your design endeavors. And I hope you learned something today.